Good morning and welcome to your morning briefing from Early Warning Network. It is Thursday, the 6th of February, 2025. I'm your host, Mark Nielsen. I'm joined by the team. We've got Jared, Mike Shelby, and Robert is out today. So let's jump inside the Beltway. Trump's new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is now going to be stopping all Department of Justice grants to sanctuary cities. She issued a memo ordering an end to all federal grants that are administered through the Department of Justice for sanctuary jurisdictions that refuse to comply with immigration authorities. The order also prohibits the DOJ from entering into any new contracts, grants, or other agreements that would provide federal funds to non-governmental organizations that support or provide services to illegal aliens. Also, Democrats have now threatened articles of impeachment for Trump. Specifically, Representative Al Green of Texas announced that he will file a motion to impeach President Trump for, quote, dastardly deeds proposed and dastardly deeds done, unquote. Now, Green has launched multiple unsuccessful impeachment bids against Trump in the past during his first term. And there really aren't any signs as of yet that the rest of his caucus, that the congressional Democrats, will be supporting his latest effort. But it is something to watch as this has started to float around in the media. Now, the Department of Justice also has limited DOJ, or the Department of Government Efficiency. It has limited its personnel from accessing Treasury's it is only allowing for read-only access to Department of Treasury records. So in an effort to quell concerns over security risks, the Treasury Department has released a memo and informed Congress that it will only allow DOJ personnel to have read-only access to government payment systems. And the official also went on to say that the ongoing review that DOJ is conducting right now has not caused any payments or obligations such as Social Security and Medicare to be delayed or rerouted. And then finally, Mike, I'm going to pull you on for this one. Love to hear what you think here. But it looks like the Democrats might be trying to tank the Trump administration on this next funding bill. What's going on there?
Could be. Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed, but Democrats are pretty livid over this Elon Musk and Doge thing, taking a hatchet to some of their favorite federal grants and programs. This is important because coming up on 14 March, just over a month away here, Republicans will need Democrat support to avert a potential partial government shutdown. And that is going to be most likely by raising the federal debt ceiling, which is something that Trump and some Republicans want. And the problem is Democrats are signaling right now that they don't want to go along with that. They've lodged their numerous complaints and lawsuits against Doge, and all signs right now point to the Doge team accelerating their sweep to these government budgets. And this is important because Republicans, the Trump administration, will need 60 votes in the Senate to pass this debt ceiling bill. Republicans have just 53 seats here. And also the GOP has this razor thin majority in the House. It's down to just 3 seats. And that means that Democrats will almost certainly be needed to make up for Republicans who oppose this debt ceiling increase. And so Democratic members of Congress are already considering their leverage here next month against the Trump administration over this debt ceiling fight. Last week, Senate Appropriations Committee Patty Murray, she's a senior Democrat on that committee. She said that the Trump administration's decision to gut federal budgets, quote, makes it virtually impossible for us to reach a bipartisan compromise on appropriations. Also, Representative Ted Lieu, Democrat from California, is already putting the blame on a possible government shutdown on Trump and the GOP. He said, quote, Republicans control the White House, the Senate, and the House. It is completely on Republicans to not have a government shutdown. So Democrats are clearly viewing this debt ceiling fight as an opportunity to push back, which could come back to plague the Trump administration. I don't think anyone can imagine a partial government shutdown in the second month of a Trump presidency. But here we are staring this scenario, honestly staring it down in the face.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And no, I'll keep you on here. So our last item here, every year the Fed releases stress tests, right? This helps us kind of understand what the impact would be to the financial sector during a severe recession. But it looks like that they've released one for this year as well. What's going on there, Mike?
Yeah, so the Fed just released this year's scenario stress test. They say this helps ensure that large banks can continue to lend to households and businesses even during a period of severe recession. This year, they're looking at 22 banks. And I noted that there was a large number of U.S. banks that have obviously potentially catastrophic risks, not only to financial market, but also counterparty risk. And this is one of the things that the Fed wants to test against. So they're testing against this severe global recession scenario. And this scenario includes a 10% unemployment rate, which would be probably around the 2008 crisis unemployment rate, as calculated by the government, not the real unemployment rate. It also includes severe market volatility and a collapse in asset prices. So they're looking at a 33% drop in home prices and a 30% drop in commercial real estate. They want to test these banks to make sure they will remain solvent in this scenario where they're collapsing asset prices. The Fed was very clear to point out that these scenarios, quote, should not be interpreted as predictions of future economic conditions. But this is a very realistic scenario because analysts for years have pointed to high home prices and high equity prices, extreme market concentration, and this commercial real estate bubble. And they've been warning about this stuff for years. I mean, I remember they're even talking about CRE bubble back in 22. And this commercial real estate bubble is really based on what have been unrealistic valuations and also high vacancy rates, kind of historic high vacancy rates. So some analysts and investors have significant doubts that any of this stuff is going to happen because they say international demand for U.S. equities and for U.S. treasuries and the dollar remains high, and they are still widely considered among the safest places to park your money in the world. It's kind of like the dollar is the worst currency in the world, except for all the others. That's pretty much what we're looking at here.
All right. Thanks, Mike. All right. Now let's move on to our roll-up items for the day. So let's kick things off first with Citigroup. Citigroup came out and has, Citi Research has come out and released a report stating that they expect Brent crude oil to stay around $60 per barrel in the second half of 2025. According to Citi Rep, we remain strongly of the view that President Trump could ultimately prove to be a bearish influence on the oil market and for the rest of the year. Also, moving on, Google has recently updated its ethics policy by removing an existing pledge to not use artificial intelligence for weapons or surveillance. Now, the revised policy still states that Google will pursue AI responsibly, according to, quote, widely accepted principles of international law and human rights, unquote. But the longstanding provision refraining from using AI for weapons and surveillance has been recently changed, and it's caused a bit of controversy among watchdog groups. All right, now moving on to the rest of our roll-up items. Jared, I'm going to hand this off to you. Looks like we have some Russian nuclear drills. What's going on?
Absolutely. So Russia is running a couple of nuclear stealth maneuver drills over in the Volga region, and they are ratifying the expansion of the nuclear umbrella to include Belarus today. Additionally, Russia fired the head of the Roscosmos program and replaced him with a much younger kind of Russian equivalent of Elon Musk. Canada announced that they will run a joint economic summit with the United States this Friday, specifically because the tariffs are paused, actually. And the goal of the summit is to use American trade, business, and public policy expertise in order to grow Canada's economy. And India is facing sanctions over developing Iran's Chabahar port, which we covered quite a bit last year, and the implications of that. That's all.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Jared, could you take us through the remainder of your roll-up items?
Mark, we're moving on. I finished the roll-up items.
My bad. Sorry. I was just a little bit on a delay. All right. Thank you, Jared. Let's move on now to our warning items for the day. Mike, it looks like we have a downward revision on the jobs report. What's going on there?
Yeah, so this annual jobs report is coming out tomorrow, and this is something that economists have already pointed to. Last August, we reported they were expecting about an 800,000 downward revision to the 2024 final jobs report, and now analysts are saying maybe it's not quite 800,000, maybe it's only 600,000, but this is still the largest annual downward revision since 2009, and this matters for several reasons. Number one, investors and economists look at this jobs data as an indicator of economic health. And we have been told for years about the strong Biden economy. And this annual jobs report, if it is somewhere in the ballpark of 600 to 800,000 jobs, inflated jobs that they're now taking off that jobs number, that's going to challenge this prevailing view that the U.S. labor market and jobs growth were historically strong in the final year of the Biden presidency. That was one of the many reasons why investment banks discounted the possibility of recession and they said, hey, the labor market's really strong. This is going to be a soft landing. So far, it has been. The current unemployment rate is about 4.1%, but this does not really give us the full picture, as government numbers rarely do. There's about 5.5 million people who can't find a job, and they are not considered unemployed because they're not actively looking for a job. So we have about 7 million Americans who are actually out of work, and that is reflected in this unemployment number. But you combine those two, and the real unemployment rate is closer to about 7%. Now, also, it's maybe even a little bit worse than that. Another 5 million workers were part-time due to economic reasons. And this is mostly because employers were reducing their employee hours instead of laying them off. So that's another 5 million Americans who are not reflected in that unemployment number. The average work week for production and non-supervisory employees is 33.7 hours. That is down from nearly 35 hours per week in 2021. And then additionally, another 600,000 Americans are part-time workers because they couldn't find full-time jobs. Again, that is not reflected in this 4.1 unemployment rate. So these are some small details that add up to a slightly worse picture than is being reported.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Let's move over to our Jared's portion of the warning items. We'll hit the global. Jared, we've discussed this a little bit before the show, but it looks like Jordan has had an official response to the question of displaced Palestinians. What's going on over there?
Yes, so Jordan's king publicly rejected any attempts to annex land and displace Palestinians. And according to anonymous Jordanian government sources, Jordan's willing to declare war on Israel if the Palestinians are displaced. And the Jordanian sources actually acknowledge that they would likely lose the war, but the government would still be prepared to fight it. Now, the King of Jordan is scheduled to meet with President Donald Trump over in the White House on Tuesday. And meanwhile, Israel's defense minister actually ordered the Israeli army to develop a plan to assist Gazans that wish to leave and called on Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Canada to receive the Gazans.
All right. And Jared, just one thing I want to add, and I'd like to pass this over to Mike, see what his take is, but just something for those who are a little bit unfamiliar with the region. When it comes to Jordan, Jordan is in a very unique position where the royal family not only has a hostile neighbor in Israel, which is backed by the United States, so it has to navigate that. But at the same time, the royal family has a large Palestinian population living in Jordan, and that Palestinian population has over time become more and more radicalized against the royal family. And so you have this situation where the Jordanian government has to balance out having very serious international commitments and geopolitical concerns with the fact that they have a very hostile domestic population that you have to convey information to. And so a lot of these statements that are going to come out are going to be very interesting to look at which part of this tightrope the royal family is walking. Mike, what's your take on this?
You know, I don't really have a dog in this fight other than to acknowledge none of these Arab countries want the Palestinians. They voted for Hamas, which launched the terror. You know, it's back and forth, Israel and Hamas. But who would want 1 million or 2 million of these people living in their country promoting extremism and terrorism? And if it's not directed at the Israelis, Mark, like you mentioned, it's going to be directed at the home government. Who wants these people? It's completely, I don't care what Trump says, it is completely unrealistic for any of these countries to take the Gazans. Palestinians. I don't think any amount of money is going to suffice in that trade.
I think it's a great point, Mike. Throughout history, we've seen a lot of these Middle Eastern governments, once they have had a Palestinian problem in their own countries, these displaced persons, it has resulted in things like political assassinations, unrest. And so, I think that in the West, we often look at this like there should be solidarity between Arabs throughout the Middle East. But if you look at the Middle East and you see the conflicts there really isn't solidarity anywhere else. So the Palestinian question is one that is not easy to untangle, especially for those governments. And Jordan really is ground zero for this displaced Palestinian problem, is when you have population transfer into a country like Jordan. It does not have the capacity to be able to handle what comes along with that, especially on the political side. So the royal family in Jordan is one of those that we play ball with. It's like Egypt. We have really strong relations with them. And so to see how Jordan responds will really kind of mark the tone for much of the rest of the region. But great analysis and perspective there. All right, moving on now, Jared. So let's talk a little bit about Trump's effect on international organizations. What do you see going on there?
Yes. So Argentina announced it's going to be withdrawing from the World Health Organization due to deep differences regarding the World Health Organization's disaster management, which is the exact same reason that the Trump administration cited in the executive order. And Israel announced its withdrawal from the United Nations Human Rights Council, citing anti-Semitism, and President Trump's withdrawal announcement himself. Now, when taking into account both of these and the Indonesian and Argentinian withdrawals from the Paris Climate Accords that we covered, I think it was earlier this week, I think it was Monday, it appears that Trump's unilateral withdrawals are having a secondary effect on lower tier nations leaving international organizations, where they just get the courage or they just cite the same reason to say, okay, yeah, we don't want to be part of this either. This is detrimental to us. And overall, that I think that there's quite a bit of intrigue on where that could go, but generally, I think that will result in a weakening and potentially a dissolution of some of the lesser international organizations.
All right, thanks, Jared. All right, let's move over now to the Oh, excuse me. Oh, yeah, Mike, I would like to get your take on this. What's going on?
Yeah, I don't really have a take. It's more of a question. Jared and Mark, one of the things that we've seen from China is the creation of these alternative international organizations. So we've seen BRICS, we've seen the Import-Export Bank, we've seen the Shanghai Coalition or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all these international organizations are meant to compete with the United Nations, with WTO, with all of these really Western-led, Western-backed international organizations. My big question is, what does this do to China's strategy? I mean, the United States is withdrawing from these organizations that are clearly globalist. They're also clearly failing to do what's best for their member nations here. And what do you see China doing as a response? I mean, obviously they're coming in, they're backing World Health Organization. They've come in and they've backed a number of countries where the United States is more or less backing out. What do you see the Chinese doing here?
Well, I think the Chinese will probably fall back on one of their favorite tactics of elite and organizational capture. So anywhere that they have disputed power, such as the Human Rights Council or the Security Council, which I don't think Trump's going to pull out of the Security Council, but if he did, that would give China an opening in order to, okay, well, now we're this. But that also, in my opinion, weakens the entire institution, because that would make it entirely partisan on the world stage. And I think that's a bigger threat, is that when China falls into that trap of moving into a position of power, it will generally just discolor everybody else's opinion on it, because they'll look at it as an extension of China rather than an international forum to conduct diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mike, I think to kind of piggyback off of what Jared is saying, I agree with this in the sense that the United States can retreat from some of these international institutions, which very much the United States holds up. It kind of the lifeblood of a lot of these organizations. It's really under U.S. leadership that we even have that these organizations function, that they do what they will. Even if we see wrangling between the United States and some of the partners, it really does depend on American leadership. And I think China is in a position where they want to be more of a global leader. But over and over, we see that China seems incapable of being able to have the same kind of of leadership and effect on the rest of the world that the United States does. So even if the United States, let's say it declines, let's say the United States continues to retreat on the world stage, there will be a vacuum. Undoubtedly China will want to fill that. But given the way that it operates on the international stage, its foreign relations with its neighbors and with other countries, it does have like a lot of incentives that it can offer. But at the same time, it just does not seem to have that component of leadership. And so my expectation wouldn't be as much that China would fill the void as the United States has in the past, but that China would attempt to, but the world would still continue to be more chaotic. And a lot of these organizations would just kind of fall into obsolescence.
Hey, one more thing, Mark. I forgot to mention the new development bank, which is just the glossier name for the BRICS development bank. These things, the import-export bank, these things were proposed by China to compete with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In 2022, Xi Jinping gave this speech where he made this oblique reference that he was going to launch this global security initiative. And, you start getting into that, and it really looks like Xi Jinping's strategy is to unite the global South countries, what we call the third world, against the global North countries, which are predominantly Western. And the long-term goal is to displace the U.S. dollar. Remove the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency from like 20 to 40% of the world, gain parity with the United States by peeling back some of that power and influence that's wielded through the dollar. So I look at the World Health Organization. I mean, okay, they're wrong. The Human Rights Council is absolutely a joke. I guess my bigger question here is, what can we expect from the Trump administration to counter some of these Chinese efforts to control new international organizations, which they've been standing up for the past couple of years?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. I mean, a lot of these institutions, I think, are if they serve a purpose, if a purpose of a system is what it does, is really it does hold up American leadership and the dollar. And so while that might not be their explicit purpose, that's what in effect they do. And I think that's why we're all often reluctant to shift around, change around some of these deck chairs too much. With Trump coming into office and under, especially, Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State will have a really big impact on this as well. I think, though, that it's really, I can't say, I think the strategy that the Trump administration has on reapplying the U.S. national interest to everything that the United States does abroad and to its interactions with these partners and with these organizations, I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think it will set the tone for the rest of the world. As in terms of a leadership position and where Trump will go with this, I'm not sure exactly. There's kind of two things that could happen as the United States starts to embrace this multipolar situation that we might be entering into. There's also the likelihood that you could see a lot more tension, a lot more need for hard diplomacy. There can be a lot more instability in the international system, even if the United States tries to conduct better foreign policy. But then at the same time, these international organizations and the way in which the world has been operating in the past, I don't know if that model will continue on with the changes that we're seeing. So Trump might try to create some kind of new international order. Maybe that as a grand strategy is on his plate. I just don't know if that's possible in the world to come. And so I just, to answer your question, I think a lot of the expectations that we have are still kind of boiled into this past way of looking at the globe. And I think the globe has changed and is changing so much that it's probably more realistic to just see how the United States moves ahead and provides the example for the rest of the world. I think that the national interest as something that countries tie into their foreign policy is going to be so much more important. And the United States is really trying to show that that's the way that the world will operate. I don't think China can really change that. All right. Okay, let's move on now to our next warning item. Jared, looks like that we've talked a lot about the Philippines and its strategic import. What's going on over there?
Yes, so the Philippines Air Force published a video of their fighters conducting a joint air patrol with two U.S. Air Force B-1 stealth bombers over the South China Sea yesterday. Now, this is a significant show of force to China, and as far as I can tell, this was the first time the B-1s were actually over in the South China Sea. And the B-1s are commonly known as nuclear bombers, but they are actually not nuclear capable. They haven't been for about 30 years. That, nevertheless, each one of these can carry 125,000 pounds of ordnance. So this is an enormous show of force. And on top of that, they have a pretty robust combat suite that would pretty much allow them to evade or at least be highly defensible. These things, I think, I think it's reasonable to say they would be able to wipe out a single People's Liberation Army Navy surface action group, maybe even a strike group, with little effort. In addition to that, they are Air Force, and the Air Force runs the quick sink bomb, which is effectively a one-shot kill on basically any surface vessel. So these things are very, very powerful, and I'm looking forward to see what China's response is to this.
All right, thanks, Jared. For our last item for the day, it looks like Alberta is now considering an LNG deal with Japan. Before you jump into this one, Jared, I'll note that we've talked a lot about how tariffs are affecting the rest of the world and global economy. There's been a lot of frustration or fear in the markets. But it looks like that the threat of tariffs and trade war has had a pretty positive effect actually on Japan. If you look at the value of the different currencies, the dollar is doing very well, but Japan's been doing pretty well too. And so I think that this all relates to this next item. What's going on over there?
Yes. So Alberta is if it's not the top producing petroleum product province in Canada, then it is the number 2. It's considering a liquid natural gas deal with Japan in order to diversify its export markets away from vulnerability to U.S. tariffs, and explicitly to help Japan achieve energy security. Now, as far as why does this matter? Is it just Alberta, trying to get away? Well, that means what this means is the tariffs are helping American Pacific allies like Canada and Japan to establish energy security networks. And this is a net positive for war preparedness in the Pacific, because Canada is a major fossil fuel producer, and Japan is entirely dependent on importing its energy needs.
All right, thanks, Jared. All right, that does it for today's warning items. We do have a couple questions in the chat we can get to before we end the show today. There was a question from Ben regarding USAID and some of the changes that the Trump administration has imposed. The question goes, for some of the more noteworthy leftist direct action protesting, what % would you guess is funded by organizations like USAID and other taxpayer-funded aid organizations? Mike, this is your wheelhouse. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I don't know of any direct ties. They may be in the data. I'm sure some Twitter sleuth will jump in there and figure it out. But we know lots of progressive NGOs get this money. And I've been asked this question for a long time. Like Antifa, some of these far left groups, where did their funding come from? And near as I can tell, I don't think there was any direct payments. I think initially a lot of these groups were self-funded. But when you start to see standardized gear, and when you start to see clearly kind of like assembly line produced gear that these groups were using, it's at least centrally produced. And I think more than anything, it's probably trickled down. I think a lot of these protest groups back in 2020 got a lot of money, and I don't think anyone was writing checks to Antifa, but I think some of that money probably did trickle down into some of these groups just for material support. As a percentage of what organizations did that, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Last question we can get to today is by Bad Wabbit. They ask, what does the team believe will be a result of the loss of American leadership in the UN fractions? In other words, what will they devolve to, and what will they be effective, and will they be effective moving forward? Mike, I'm happy to pass this on to the rest of the team, but one of the things that I think it goes back to that observation about how the world has changed. I think what we will interpret as a loss of leadership, much of that it can be attributed to the way that the world is changing. Overall, globalization's on the retreat. These alliances that we have are actually very strong coming out of the Biden administration. So that's something that, we're still holding on to a lot of these agreements. But you will watch that we have a lot of bilateral trade and security deals that are coming, that are becoming a lot more popular now. We're seeing a lot more of that around the world. And the U.S. as a global leader is going to have to navigate this just like everybody else. And so I think that my overall here is that I think that we're still going to see that there will be a lot of American leadership on the international stage. It will still probably support a lot of these institutions in various ways, either directly or indirectly. And how the United States operates is going to have a major impact on how the rest of the world follows suit. But at the same time, I think that the world has changed to such a degree that what we consider to be American leadership, maybe during the Cold War, will not look anything like what American leadership looks like today. These institutions will likely start to change. And we've seen in the past with, major changes in how the world is working. You could go back to like the 70s, you could go back to the 50s. Many of these institutions that were prevalent at the time had to either completely change or they had to be consolidated into something else. And I think that we're likely to see that some of these longstanding institutions will change in character, if not completely. Anybody else on the team have any insight into that?
Yeah, just briefly, the UN, United Nations, really is a vestigial organization of the previous century. They failed to keep the peace. They failed to prevent war. There's not a lot of unity in the United Nations. So I would be happy to see them go away. I'm not sure they need to be replaced, but I kind of, a lot of people say NATO is also kind of antiquated because it's no longer, it was built for the Soviets. The Soviets are no longer around. So we're still in the first roughly, I guess, quarter now of this century, and there's going to have to be some new global organization. And I'm not saying that I promote that or I would support it, but clearly there will be. China, this is what China's building, the Global Security Initiative, something to probably replace the United Nations, something that is Eastern-led versus Western-led. All these international organizations are clearly failing the world, so something has to be done there.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
I think to the extent that it does stick around at all, which for at least a while it will, I think we're going to see much clearer factions. Right now it's been a bit muddy for the last few decades, but I think that's going to clear up. And in addition to that, I think we're going to see much more nationalistic diplomacy on those stages. It's less about, we need equity or we need, development generally. No, what does that mean? You need energy, you need security. Who's providing you with that? I think that's going to be what we see coming out of the next few years and probably the next decade.
All right. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Jared. That does it for today's briefing. We really do appreciate all the support and you tuning in. We will have today's report in your inbox later on today. And then we will be back tomorrow with tomorrow's report at 08 Central Time. Also, we will have tomorrow's roundtable, which will address many of the questions we were unable to get to during the show throughout the week. That will be at 10 Central Time. So please tune in for that as well. But again, we do appreciate you listening to us. Thank you for all your support. And as always, stay out front.